All right, so you guys sent us a whole bunch of information on Power Grid Corporation of India,
Mm.
including their Q2 FY25 financials
Hmm.
and a list of like questions that you have about all this.
Yeah, it's fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
Really
So
interesting.
like you handed us a treasure map
Right.
and we're ready to like explore all the ins and outs of this major power player in India.
So we're basically doing a financial health checkup on
Bruh.
this big company.
Yeah.
And one of the things that jumps out right away is they're paying out their first interim dividend of the year,
Oh,
4.5 rupees per share.
yeah, a 45% payout.
Yep.
Pretty significant for shareholders.
Yeah, if you're a shareholder.
If you're a shareholder, mark your calendars because Thursday, November 14th, 2024 is the record date. So that's important.
Let's look at some of their performance this quarter.
Okay.
Looking at profit, we see they've had a year-on-year increase, but a little dip compared to last quarter.
Okay.
Revenue is a little more nuanced.
Hmm.
Standalone revenue dipped a little bit,
Okay.
but that's because they transferred their telecommunications business to a subsidiary.
So like when a company spins off a whole division to
Exactly.
streamline things.
Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to point out before we get to your questions is that
Yeah.
Power Grid is proposing to sell 26% of its shareholding in 4 associate companies to its infrastructure investment trust.
Yeah. Speaking of strategic moves,
Yeah.
that one definitely caught my eye too.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, think of an infrastructure investment trust as like a special fund
Okay.
that focuses on infrastructure projects.
Okay.
So this could signal a shift in strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It might allow them to free up capital for new investments or double down on certain growth areas,
So they might be getting ready to make some big moves.
potentially.
Now on to your questions.
All right.
You had a lot of good ones.
Yeah.
We're going to tackle them using the data straight from Power Grid's financial reports.
Sounds good.
So let's start with question number 9, which asks about the overall health of India's power transmission sector.
All right.
What can Power Grid's performance tell us about the bigger picture?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Power Grid is a dominant force in India's power transmission sector.
Mm-hmm.
So their strong financials,
Yeah.
despite some challenges,
Right.
suggest their stability and growth in the sector.
Okay.
But of course, you have to consider other factors like government policies and investments in renewable energy.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
So let's zoom in on Power Grid specifically.
Okay.
You were curious about their debt levels,
Yes.
what those might signal about future growth.
Question number 7.
Yep.
Their standalone statement of assets and liabilities shows
Okay.
their borrowings have actually increased year on year.
Okay.
They're sitting at a total of 122,499.25 crore rupees as of September 30th, 2024.
So their debt has gone up, but they're also pouring money into new projects.
Right.
It seems like they're going all in on this renewable energy strategy.
That's a good point.
Yes.
And speaking of investments,
Yes.
let's look at question 15, which is about capital
Yeah.
expenditure.
Right. You want to know how Power Grid managed its spending
Yep.
and investments in Q2.
Yeah.
So what can we glean from their statement of cash flows?
Looks like they've been carefully managing their capital expenditure and investments this quarter.
Okay.
And that leads perfectly to another point I wanted to highlight about their investments.
Okay.
Note, 4 mentions a brand new joint venture
Okay.
between Power Grid in Rajasthan, Rajiv Vidyut Prasaran Nigam Limited, or RRVPNL for short.
This new joint venture is focused on developing the interstate transmission system in Rajasthan.
That's right.
And the ownership split is interesting.
Yeah.
Power Grid has a 74% stake,
Mm-hmm.
while RRVPNL holds 26%.
Right.
Looks like Power Grid is calling the shots in this partnership.
Indeed.
What do you make of that?
Well, it's a strategic move that could strengthen their presence in a key state for energy infrastructure development.
So zooming back out, we got this backdrop of Power Grid increasing its debt.
While simultaneously making big investments in new projects
Mm-hmm.
and strategic partnerships,
Yeah.
it paints a picture of a company that's not afraid to take calculated risks to position itself for future growth.
Definitely.
All right. Before we move on, let's circle back to that debt discussion.
Oh.
We talked about how their debt levels have increased,
Mm-hmm.
but we didn't really dig into the implications of that.
Right.
What do you think? Is this a sign of aggressive growth,
Well,
or is there a cause for concern?
it's not inherently good or bad.
Okay.
We need to look at how they're using that debt.
Okay.
If it's being used to finance strategic investments that will generate strong returns down the line,
Mm-hmm.
then it could be a sign of smart, calculated growth.
Okay.
Think of it like taking out a loan to expand your business.
Right.
It's a risk, but it can pay off if it's done right.
So we need to look at what they're doing with those borrowed funds.
Yeah,
Are there any clues in the materials you reviewed?
absolutely. If we look at their capital expenditure figures.
We can see they've invested significantly in expanding their transmission network.
Uh-huh.
And this aligns with India's ambitious renewable energy targets.
Right.
Because you need a strong transmission infrastructure to integrate renewable energy sources into the grid.
So connecting the dots, it seems like they're using debt strategically to position themselves as a key player in India's energy transition.
Precisely. They're betting on the future of renewable energy.
Okay.
And that's a bet a lot of analysts see as promising.
Speaking of promising bets, let's loop back to that infrastructure investment trust we
Yes.
mentioned earlier.
Mm.
Selling a portion of their stake in those associate companies seems like a pretty significant move.
It is. It suggests they're trying to streamline their portfolio and maybe free up capital for other initiatives.
Okay.
It could also be a way to diversify their revenue streams and reduce risk.
All very savvy moves.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap things up for this part of our deep dive,
Okay.
there's one last intriguing question we wanted to address. It wasn't explicitly in your list, but it stems from everything we've discussed so far.
You're talking about power grids' potential role in India's renewable energy future.
Exactly.
Very pertinent question.
With them making these bold moves, like expanding their transmission network,
Mm-hmm.
forming strategic joint ventures,
Yeah.
and exploring this infrastructure investment trust,
Right.
it seems like they're positioning themselves to become even more pivotal in India's shift towards cleaner energy,
I couldn't agree more.
which begs the question.
Yeah. Could power grid become India's renewable energy champion?
That's a fascinating thought, right?
Right.
They certainly seem to have the scale and the expertise,
Uh-huh.
and like we've been discussing, that strategic focus to make some serious waves in this energy transition.
Right.
Those investments they're making in expanding that transmission network,
Yeah.
absolutely critical for connecting those more renewable energy projects to the grid.
For sure.
And then you look at their forays into new technologies like smart grids,
Mhm.
energy storage.
Yeah.
All that stuff could further solidify their position as a real innovator in the sector.
It's all about staying ahead of the curve.
Right.
And they seem to be anticipating the future needs
Uh-huh.
of India's energy landscape.
Yeah. So if you're looking at Power Grid as a company
Yeah.
and thinking about their long-term prospects,
Right.
it seems like they're setting themselves up to be a major player, not just in India's energy present, but also in its energy future.
And a future that's looking increasingly green.
Right.
India's commitment to renewable energy
Mm-hmm.
is only getting stronger,
Yeah.
and Power Grid is right there ready to seize those opportunities.
We've covered a lot of ground already in this deep dive.
We have.
From those dividends to debt levels,
Mhm.
strategic shifts, and even a little glimpse into India's evolving renewable energy landscape.
Yeah, and we've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's so many more insights
Yeah.
buried in these financial statements that you sent.
Uh-huh.
I highly encourage you to keep exploring. You might uncover even more details about Power Grid's operations and their plans for the future.
Always more to discover.
Right.
But before we let you go,
Okay.
one final thought-provoking question.
Right.
Something to ponder as you continue your own deep dive into this world of energy finance.
Okay.
We talked about Power Grid's existing partnerships,
Yeah.
their investments,
Uh-huh.
but what other moves could they make?
Right.
What else could they do to accelerate India's clean energy transition?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's something to think about as you continue exploring their story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a giant puzzle.
It is.
Trying to figure out what pieces they're going to put in place next
Yeah.
to build out their role in this whole renewable energy future.
And that's what makes it so interesting to analyze.
Right.
They've clearly shown that they're willing to make these big bets
Mm-hmm.
that could totally change the energy landscape.
So what stood out to you the most as we went through all this information?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is how strategically Power Grid is approaching this whole clean energy transition.
Yeah.
They're not just reacting to market trends, they're actively shaping the future.
Yeah, they're making bold moves,
Mhm.
calculated risks,
Right.
and they're thinking long term, which, let's be honest, isn't always something you see in the corporate world.
No, it's not.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
Yeah.
We often think of financial statements as just numbers on a page,
Yeah.
but they can actually tell a really compelling story.
They do.
And in Power Grid's case, that story is one of ambition, innovation, and a commitment to being a driving force in India's sustainable energy future.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So to recap, Power Grid is paying out a nice dividend.
Mm.
They're making strategic shifts in their portfolio,
Mm.
and they're investing a ton in expanding their transmission network to support India's renewable energy goals,
Yeah.
all while navigating those debt
They're
levels.
a company to watch.
Absolutely. If this deep dive has piqued your interest, we encourage you to dig into those source documents yourselves.
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
You might find some really fascinating information.
For sure.
And who knows, maybe you'll come up with your own theories about what the future holds for Power Grid
Right.
and its role in shaping India's energy destiny.
It's a bright future.
Until next time, keep those financial fires burning.